Hello and welcome. What does it mean to be a superpower when political dynamics of the world stage are changing so quickly? The military might of the United States is seen as less and less relevant in the light of economic strength of China and the rapid growth of India and Latin America. For the first time in about 2 centuries, the global power axis is shifting, and once voiceless nations are finding themselves in a position of greater influence, both political and economic. Meanwhile, popular uprisings in the Arab world have shown the strength of the masses over the military, overturning the rule of hardline leaders entrenched for decades. The impact of social media and globalized communication has, according to some, led to a diffusion and reconfiguration of power. So today we ask, how is global power being redefined in the 21st century? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or an email, and we also welcome your phone calls on the show. To discuss these issues, I'm joined by Dr. Joseph Nye, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense and internationally renowned Professor of International Relations. He has written many articles and books on the subject, including his most recent, The Future of Power, which explores shifting global power relationships in the 21st century, and argues that despite conventional wisdom, the power of the U.S. is not necessarily in decline, but that it's faced with different challenges in how to lead. Professor Nye, good to have you on the show, sir.
Nice to be with you.
Well, so there are a lot of those who believe that, America built an empire across the globe, then it overstretched, and now that empire is crumbling. I wonder what do you find wrong with that assessment of the U.S.'s situation?
Well, I don't think it was an empire, first of all, and on the overstretch idea, the Americans actually spend less of their gross domestic product on defense today than they did during the Cold War. So that doesn't fit the usual model of imperial overstretch. I think what's happening in the United States is much more interesting than that classical old-fashioned narrative. And that's what I argue in the book. There are 2 big power shifts going on. There's a shift from west to east, a transition among states as you see the recovery of Asia. And there's a diffusion of power away from all states to non-state actors. And we've seen good evidence of this in the Middle East, but we also see it in cyber relations, in WikiLeaks and cybersecurity issues today. Those are much more interesting challenges to face, and it doesn't matter whether you're declining or rising. Those are major challenges.
Professor, if I may, an email question that came in from the UK from a viewer here. Billy Hussein in London wrote in saying the US has pursued unsustainable policies that have resulted in a massive fiscal deficit and the erosion of its manufacturing base. As a result, its capacity to influence global affairs is more limited than a decade ago. Is the US in terminal decline, or can it recover from such economic difficulties?
Well, if you think of absolute decline, let's say what happened to ancient Rome, 2 things to note. One is it took Rome 300 years to decline, but more important, Rome was an agrarian society with no economic productivity growth. The United States is rated by the World Economic Forum as the 4th most competitive economy in the world. China, incidentally, is number 27. It's also at the forefront of new technologies like biotechnology and nanotechnology. So this is not a picture of absolute decline, but there are serious American problems. The budget deficit is one, and one of the interesting questions over the next few years is whether the American political system will deal with this. Is it capable of dealing with it in terms of economics? Yes. In politics? Well, we're fighting about that right now.
So, I mean, just to get this correct, in terms of defining economic power over military power, to what degree perhaps might China, with its growing economic power and its strong clout overall on the economic global stage, what sort of strength might it have over the US's potential military power then?
Well, China has an impressive economic performance with 10% growth. It's done very well, and I would say it's plausible that in the next 10 years or so, China will have an economy which will be equal to the United States in overall size. But notice that when economies are equivalent of size, it doesn't mean they're equivalent in composition. That you measure by gross domestic product per person. And in that measure, the Chinese are not likely to equal the U.S. for another couple of decades beyond 2020s, if then.
Another email from the UK here, sir. This came in from Ansar Bakshi in London, who writes in saying, Since having been the world hegemon since World War II, the US has affected global peace negatively. A multipolar balance of power will be a welcome improvement in international affairs compared to the status quo. And it makes me wonder, how important do you feel it is to balance a superpower? I mean, how important is there for there to be a balance and more than one superpower?
Well, notice back historically when you had multipolarity in the 19th century, that didn't necessarily produce peace. It often produced war. There's less likely to be a major conflict, a world war, when you have one country which is larger than the rest militarily, because others don't dare challenge it. But if you think about power in the world today, it's a mistake to think that power is the same in all contexts. If you think of a three-dimensional chessboard as a metaphor, on the top board of military relations among states, the U.S. is the only superpower, and it'll probably remain that way for another couple of decades. But if you go to the middle board of economic relations among states, the world is multipolar, and Europe, China, Japan, and others balance American power. And if you go to the bottom board of transnational relations, things that cross borders outside the control of governments, everything from terrorism to financial flows to climate change, power is chaotically distributed. It makes absolutely no sense to talk about hegemony or unipolarity or multipolarity. And the only way you can solve these problems, which are the new problems of the diffusion of power, is through cooperation among governments, through using soft power, developing networks of cooperation.
So we have the first caller on the line from Virginia. John's on the line with us. John, go ahead, please.
Hi, Riz. The American economy has suffered from the fraud perpetrated by the wealthy, so that they now control so many Congress people that they kind of run the show. The multinationals go where they don't have to pay taxes. They need to pay to defend the people of the world. There should be a wealth tax against multinationals and billionaires to fund and increase the United Nations and the International Criminal Court. And banking secrecy allows corruption. Banking secrecy must
John, let me put it this way to Professor Nye. Professor, to what degree has the American public sort of defaulted on its real control of democratic power by essentially handing over to the politicians, who might now, as John in Virginia is indicating, be manipulated by multinational corporations?
Well, there's always been a pressure of special interests in American politics. Alas, that goes with democracy. But remember, only a decade ago, a little over a decade ago, in the Clinton administration, the United States had a budget surplus. In fact, people were worried about what we're going to do with the budget surplus, not the deficit. And what you see is during the Bush administration, Bush gives away the tax base by giving tax cuts to wealthy people. He also fights two wars without paying for them, and the net result is a large deficit. So the big question is the political system being able to cope with this deficit now. We're seeing in the commission, the bipartisan commission, the Bowles-Simpson Commission, a reasonable plan to move in that direction. And I think we're going to see a lot of political bargaining over the next year or two along those lines. So I don't think it's outside of the capacity of the political system to deal with this. But will special interests play a role? Of course. That's 200 years of that.
But by and large, what I'm getting at, Professor, is to what degree does the American public have a real say in what happens in terms of policies? I mean, to what degree has the public essentially handed over the baton to the politicians and said, okay, you run the show, and the public remains largely ignorant or disinterested, perhaps through, it's reality TV and no real interest in the news, so to speak?
Well, the public actually played a significant role. If you think back to 2008, the conventional wisdom was that you had to have a big name and a lot of money to get elected president. Then Obama got elected president with a name that was not familiar and even sounded strange to many. And he had the independent voters on his side. By 2010, after the recession and the belief that we were running into big problems of overspending, those independent voters switched back to the Republicans. And you have this Tea Party movement, which turned around the House of Representatives. That certainly is responsiveness to public opinion. In my opinion, too much so. But you can't say that it wasn't a big switch in public opinion which has affected in terms of democratic terms, in changeover in the House of Representatives.
Understood, sir. But in terms of the actual cost, I mean, in terms of the money being raised now when it comes to politics in America, it's the numbers have just soared, haven't they?
Oh, that's true. But as a percent of GDP, it's not that overwhelming. But it's true that if you want to run for office, you need money. On the other hand, it's worth noticing that some of the millionaires who self-finance and spend lots on their campaigns don't always win. So the argument that you can just buy yourself an election, sure, money is influential, but it isn't always determining.
Let me get another email to here. So this came in from Cardiff in the UK, and Patrick Fitzgerald wrote in saying, President Obama's continuation of an interventionist foreign policy is preventing US citizens and political leadership from soberly examining its role in the world, whether promoting stability or contributing to destabilization and resentment. In terms of US intervention in the world, does the US even have a choice anymore? Hasn't it become the sort of the go-to power when anything's wrong?
Well, my own view is that President Eisenhower had wise advice when he said, don't get involved in land wars in Asia. And I think one of the interesting questions for President Obama is, how do you get from mistakes that have been made in the last decade to following Eisenhower's advice? And he has proposed that we'll be out of Iraq at the end of this year, and he's also proposed a plan to turn over security in Afghanistan to Afghan forces by 2014. That may turn out to be easier said than done, but I think at least the sense of direction in which he's trying to go makes sense.
Shaukat is on the line from the United Kingdom on the phone. Shaukat, go ahead, please.
Hello, yes. What kind of progression or cooperation is needed in the European Union to lift itself from the economic crisis? Thank you.
Professor?
Well, I think Europe is going through a difficult time now, but there's more strength in Europe than people realize. We go through bouts of Euro-optimism and Euro-pessimism. Right now, after the financial crisis and the sovereign debt problems we're seeing, there's a lot of Euro-pessimism. I think if you can create this fund to help the countries like Greece and Ireland and Portugal to make sure that they can deal with this bad spell, and you can preserve the euro, then I think Europe will recover. And I would suspect that in a few years we'll have a much more optimistic view about Europe than we do now. After all, Europe is fundamentally sound, though it has some financial problems which grew out of this great financial crisis of 2008.
We have Leo on the line from Ireland. Leo, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Given America's dependence on imported energy, over the next 10 years, how will America resolve this problem without affecting their economy? Because it'll be either very high-priced energy or high-priced alternatives, now that nuclear probably will not be an option.
All right. Thank you, Leo, for that question. Professor, do you see any issue with energy security in the future for the U.S.?
Well, Americans definitely want to reduce their dependence on imported energy, and President Obama has tried to move in that direction. But it takes time. And it also is true, particularly with the problems that are facing in nuclear, the world is facing in nuclear now. Solar and wind can contribute, but they're not going to solve this problem. One of the most interesting developments in energy in America is the development of shale gas. Deep gas trapped in layers of shale rock. Turns out that that is much more plentiful than anybody believed. And that has a certain benefit. Not only is it within the continental U.S., and cheaper than oil, but it also is about half as polluting in terms of CO2 and effects on the climate.
So I wanted to ask you about your promulgation of the idea of soft power and subsequently smart power. A lot of politicians have referred to it, but I wondered, has any administration really genuinely adopted the concept of soft power and applied it?
Well, it's interesting. In China, Hu Jintao told the 17th Party Congress in 2007 that China needed to invest in its soft power, and it indeed has been spending billions of dollars on its soft power. And in the United States, Hillary Clinton announced that the policy of the Obama administration would be smart power, which is a combination of hard and soft power. And Secretary of Defense Robert Gates and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mike Mullen have both referred to the importance of investing more in soft power. And this, ironically, comes from people in charge of the Pentagon. So yeah, there are some indications of efforts to actually apply this concept in terms of policy.
To what degree was the idea of winning hearts and minds, as in the case of Afghanistan and Iraq, part of that concept of soft or even smart power? And to what degree was it successful, in your opinion?
Well, I think it wasn't, winning hearts and minds was not in my mind when I first developed the concept. I was writing a book back in 1989 and 90 called Bound to Lead, which challenged the then conventional wisdom that the United States was in decline. And I looked at American military and economic power, and I said, but there's still something else, which is the ability to get what you want through attraction and persuasion. And I called that soft power. It's also true that soft power can be part of a counterinsurgency strategy. For example, if you look at counterinsurgency, the idea is to clear, hold, and build. You use your hard military power to clear, but you clear away the enemy, but then you build schools and clinics and so forth to develop soft power. The problem with that is not the concept as such, it's the cost, and whether it really makes sense to try to mount a massive counterinsurgency in places like Afghanistan and elsewhere. As I indicated elsewhere, and as I suggest in my book, I think the Americans should not be misled into thinking that counterinsurgency is the right policy in terms of being involved in land wars in Asia.
I also wonder, Professor, to what degree any crash or dent in credibility might actually have an impact on the real power a nation has. Giving you an example, perhaps if the majority of Arabs were to feel that the US is hypocritical in its stance in Middle East policies, particularly say towards Israelis and Palestinians, that would dent the US's real power in the region.
That's true. If you're seen as hypocritical, you're not likely to be attractive. A country's soft power grows out of its culture, where it's attractive to others, its values when we live up to them, and its policies when they're seen as legitimate. And so in that sense, when policies are seen as not legitimate or when they're seen as hypocritical, it undercuts soft power. But it's interesting that even at times when American policies have been wildly unpopular, for example, during the Vietnam War, when people were marching in the streets against American policy in Vietnam, they were singing not the Communist Internationale, but Martin Luther King's "We Shall Overcome." So there was an aspect of American culture, part of the protest culture, was still attractive to people. At the same time, the government policies were not. And in that sense, I think it's important to realize that government policies are not the only source of soft power. A country's culture often arises out of its civil society. So people often say that American soft power grows out of everything from Harvard to Hollywood to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And often that produces a degree of soft power in spite of sometimes ill-advised government policies.
Now, of course, television was a force. You referred to the Vietnam War, and television was a force there. Media, I guess, has had a changing role in determining the power, kind of power a nation might have. And I wonder, when you look at the way social media has grown, how much that's really been a dynamic in changing what real power is, how real power is represented.
Oh, I think social media has been very important. Indeed, in my book, I have a phrase that says, in an information age, it's not just whose army wins, it's also whose story wins. And Twitter and Facebook had a big impact, but even though this may sound flattering to Al Jazeera, let's not forget that Al Jazeera has had a very big effect on events in the Middle East. So television is still a significant factor as well.
And to what degree, Professor, do you feel that the Arab street, as it's been described, is a source of real power?
Well, the Arab street can be a source of real power when it's organized. One of the interesting things about Tahrir Square in Egypt was the conventional wisdom used to be that there was nothing in the middle between the autocrat, Mubarak, and the religious fringe, which was regarded as extreme, the Muslim Brotherhood, and that there was no middle. In fact, the information revolution, this diffusion of power that I refer to in my book, helped to create a new middle And what's more, it gave this new middle devices to solve the problems of coordination. And that's what Facebook and Twitter helped to do. So I think there has been a transformation of the politics. It doesn't mean everything is solved. We're in the first act of a multi-act play. But certainly politics in, let's say, Egypt today are at least a three-party game with the army, the Muslim groups, and with a new secular middle, which has been empowered by this new information technology.
Now, of course, what we saw in Tunisia and Egypt was very different from what we're seeing in Libya. And I wonder how you gauge the way the struggle for power in Libya has played out.
Well, Libya, Yemen, Syria are in some ways more fractured societies than Tunisia and Egypt were. And also without armies which picked up a point of responsibility of trying to hold the ring. And the outcomes have been very sad in all three cases in terms of the people killed. What we have to hope is that Gaddafi will be isolated and overthrown. I was hoping that when Musa Kusa defected that might speed that up. It seems that he's hanging on longer than one would have hoped. But I do feel that in that case, in Libya, and also I worry about Yemen and Syria, we don't have as optimistic a prospect as we have in, let's say, Egypt or Tunisia.
Sir, another email, if I could hear. This came in from Lagos in Nigeria, from Stanley Okpala, who wrote in saying, the US remains the superpower. The same people that criticize the US want and need its help. What other country offers as much military and financial support? But one thing that makes me wonder is that there is that expression that, war is good for business. And I wonder to what degree power thrives in an environment of regional, perhaps global instability and insecurity.
Well, yes, it's true that it can help demand for defense budgets, but I think that a lot depends on what you're using your power for. I think trying to rule other countries internally to change things is something that doesn't make sense in the 21st century. But on the other hand, military power can play an important role. For example, if you look at East Asia, the rise of China has been impressive, but it has also frightened China's neighbors, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and India. And if you ask what's interesting, each of those countries welcomes an American presence to balance Chinese power. Indeed, the Japanese even pay for most of the costs of American troops that are stationed in Japan. Korea pays a significant amount as well. So this is a case where military power still plays an important role, and it's not based on profits for American military. It's based on desire of those host countries to have an American military presence to provide a sense of security, as your person in Lagos suggested.
Now, Professor, with about a minute to go, I just want to get your perspective on what you write about in your book, your latest book, The Future of Power, which explores shifts in global power in the 21st century. In about a minute, if you could give us a scenario for what things might look like, say, 10 years from now.
Well, I suspect that 10 years from now, the Chinese will be closer to the United States. I think so will Brazil, so will India. This is called the rise of the rest. But I do think the Americans will probably still be larger than any other single power. But in many ways, the big question will be not who is bigger or more powerful in the traditional sense, but who will be able to organize the networks and institutions for cooperation to deal with this diffusion of power that I mentioned in the book. This ability to deal with the challenges that are posed by non-state actors and transnational processes. And I suspect the Americans will still play a large role in that, but they're not going to be able to do it going it alone. They're going to have to work with others to be able to reach their own goals.
Well, Professor Joseph Nye, it's fascinating talking with you. Thank you very much for your perspective, sir.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you for being with us with your questions. Now, remember, you can watch a podcast of the show on iTunes. Today, we feature our conversation with former Minnesota Governor Jesse Ventura about his controversial new book, 63 Documents the Government Doesn't Want You to Read. On the next show, the Middle East counter-revolution. With Saudi Arabia at the helm, new political rifts are emerging in the region as the monarchy pushes its own agenda. Be sure to tune in for that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.